All right, guys, here we are. This is video number 4 of the peripheral nervous system. So we have covered some territory. We've been laying the foundations, trying to figure out how this whole situation is set up. And now what we're going to do is we are going to dive into the nitty-gritty in terms of neurotransmitters and receptors. And then we're going to talk about drugs. So, what are those receptors again? So we've been going over this, but let's just make sure it's sticking. So, there are two types of neurotransmitters, or pardon me, there are two types of neurotransmitters that we're going to discuss in our course for the peripheral nervous system. And there are two different classifications of receptors, one of which are the adrenergic. Those are the ones that are going to bind norepinephrine as a neurotransmitter, and those are going to get subdivided. This we haven't talked about yet. So those, remember where those are going to be located, are at the targets of the sympathetic nervous system. So smooth muscle of all hollow organs, cardiac muscle, nodal tissue of the heart, and glandular tissue. So the subtypes of adrenergic receptors, those are the ones that are going to bind norepinephrine again, are the alpha receptors. There's different types of alpha receptors, but we're really only going to focus on one type in this section. I will talk briefly about another type of alpha receptor in the central nervous system unit. But for now, we're just going to say alpha to make it easy. The beta 1s, those are found in the heart, if you remember, only. And then beta 2s. Those are found all over the place. The airway, the hollow organs. Those are responsible for increasing our metabolic rate, making sure that we have enough glucose availability to sustain ourselves through this fight or flight type of response. So adrenergic receptors, alphas, beta 1s, and beta 2s. The next class are the cholinergics. The cholinergics are going to get subdivided into two types as well. So adrenergics, those are the ones that bind norepi, or again, if you remember from the last video, we used to call norepinephrine adrenaline, so adrenergic comes from adrenaline. The cholinergics are going to get broken down into the nicotinics and the muscarinics. Apparently, early research, animal research, on the nicotinic receptors saw that acetylcholine resembled nicotine at those receptors, and so it acted as if nicotine was binding those receptors, hence the nicotinic receptor. The nicotinic receptors are going to be found in all of our ganglia. I'll show you some pictures. They're going to be found at the skeletal muscle, neuromuscular junction, and they're going to be found at the adrenal medulla. That's the location of the nicotinic receptors. Once again, all the ganglia, the neuromuscular junction, and the adrenal medulla. Okay, those are the nicotinics. They bind acetylcholine as a neurotransmitter. All cholinergic neurons bind acetylcholine as a neurotransmitter. The second group are the muscarinics. Those guys, apparently, when they did some research on those on acetylcholine binding the muscarinic receptors, apparently it induced effects like that which would be induced if you were to eat a poisonous mushroom. I think it's called the Amantia muscarinea, or muscarinic, or Amantia muscarin. Anyway, not important. Poisonous mushroom. Hence, that's how the muscarinics were named. I don't know if you need to know that. Maybe for a game show, but short of that, I probably never need to know that. But it helps sometimes to try to figure out where they get these crazy words. All right, so the muscarinic receptors are going to be found at the targets of the parasympathetic nervous system, so smooth muscle of hollow organs, cardiac nodal tissue specifically, a tiny bit in the heart muscle, but not so much, and the glandular tissue. Sorry, I was forgetting. The other place where we're going to find muscarinic receptors are going to be in a couple strange places, one of which is the sweat glands. Sweat glands are very strange in terms of innervation. We'll talk about those later. I feel like I'm missing one place that I wanted to tell you. Okay, I guess that's good enough for now. Okay, so our two receptors, again, adrenergic, cholinergic. The adrenergic gets subdivided into alphas and betas. The cholinergic gets subdivided into muscarinic and nicotinic. So let's think about where I'm going to keep repeating myself, just so you know. You know that I keep saying the same thing over again, but I'm trying to sort of present it in different ways to get it in there. So where we're going to find our adrenergic receptors. So remember, the adrenergic receptors are the receptors of the that are binding norepinephrine, and they're the primary receptors of the sympathetic nervous system. So they're going to be found at all the targets of our sympathetic nervous system. So we have them at the blood vessels, and those guys at the blood vessels, you're going to want to remember that the blood vessels are controlled by the alpha receptors. At the heart is always beta 1. Controlling both the contraction, force of contraction, and the rate of contraction. And then at the airway, beta 2s. Beta 2s are also all over the place, like they control metabolic rate, etc. I couldn't do a picture for that. All adrenergic receptors bind norepinephrine. They will also bind epinephrine if it's available, but epinephrine is released specifically from the adrenal medulla, not from these neurons. Okay? So the neurons, the postganglionic neurons of the sympathetic nervous system release norepinephrine to bind those adrenergic receptors, the alphas, the beta 1s, and the beta 2s at the target. All right. I can't always see what's happening on this slide because I have a box in front of it. Okay, there it is, norepinephrine. All right, so there we are. Now, here's another way to look at it. This is a picture that I've kind of cut up that I like out of the Lippincott textbook because it's just linear and I like things that are linear. So what you see here is a picture of kind of the setup of the sympathetic nervous system, preganglionic, postganglionic. So I'm going to show this to you a couple times in different versions of it, but for me, this works for organization. I like the way it's set up. So I would recommend that you recreate something like this for yourself for studying. So what we have here is the preganglionic neuron exiting the spinal column, right? It's the sympathetic, thoracic, and lumbar is where it comes from. It's going to have a very short preganglionic neuron, and it's going to, at the end of this preganglionic neuron, it's going to release a neurotransmitter. That has to happen, right? That's how the message gets from one place to the other. So this depolarizes electrical signal, chemical signal, release of neurotransmitter. The neurotransmitter at the ganglia and at all ganglia, not just this one, is acetylcholine. That binds a nicotinic receptor. The nicotinic receptor is found at all the ganglia on the postganglionic neuron. Okay, so then we depolarize, and if you care, it sort of helps to note that when acetylcholine binds a nicotinic receptor, what it does is it opens ion channels, sodium ion channels to be exact, and sodium dumps in there. So if you remember anything about electrophysiology, you know that when sodium dumps into a neuron, it depolarizes that neuron. If it reaches threshold, it's going to generate an action potential, which is going to get propagated electrically down this postganglionic neuron. At the end of the postganglionic neuron in the sympathetic nervous system, we're going to release norepinephrine. Norepinephrine is going to bind an adrenergic receptor at the target. What are those guys called again? Alphas. When the alpha receptor is hit, it's going to contract smooth muscle. Most notably, the smooth muscle, there's a lot of smooth muscle, but it's going to specifically, what we're going to focus on, the contraction of the smooth muscle of the arterioles. So that's going to affect our blood pressure. We'll come back to that later. The beta 1 receptors, that's where those guys are in the heart. Increase heart rate, increase contractility. Major place that those are found. And also the beta 2 adrenergic receptors. which are going to relax smooth muscle, but they're also going to increase metabolic rate. So when they relax smooth muscle, they open the airway. Remember that effect about fight or flight? The airway opens. So the smooth muscle around the vasculature is controlled by the alpha receptors, and those constrict, increasing blood pressure. The smooth muscle around your airway, when the norepinephrine hits those beta-2 receptors, it relaxes. I know, it's crazy. So much happening on. There's a chart in your book. I don't have the textbook with me, so I don't know the page, but there's all kinds of charts in this chapter. So you're going to use this information to fill in those charts. Okay, let's carry on. So we're switching gears. Let's talk about cholinergic receptors. So cholinergic receptors are really abundant. They're found in lots of places. So they're found at the targets of the parasympathetic nervous system. So the heart, mostly the AV node and the SA node and the AV node, a little bit in the heart wall. They're found at the smooth muscle of everything hollow and glandular tissue. The neurotransmitter that gets released, these are cholinergic. The neurotransmitter that gets released in this setup, because we're talking about targets, at the terminal portion of the postganglionic neuron, the neurotransmitter is acetylcholine. And the receptor here is a muscarinic receptor. We'll come back to that. Oh, there it is right there. Okay, so here's our setup. This picture looks like the sympathetic nervous system because it's a 2-neuron system. It's essentially wired the same way. These guys are going to exit from the top and the bottom, right? From the cervical region and the sacral region. They're going to be, the first neuron's going to be preganglionic, same, long, releasing, there it is again, acetylcholine. All preganglionic neurons release acetylcholine as a neurotransmitter. That acetylcholine is going to bind on the postganglionic neuron, or at the ganglia. Always binds nicotinic receptor. It's the same setup. There is no difference between the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system at the synapses of the ganglia. No difference. Same neurotransmitter, same receptor. Same kind of deal is going to happen here. We're going to open some sodium channels. Sodium's going to dump in. We're going to depolarize this neuron. If it reaches threshold, it's going to generate an action potential, which is going to send an electrical signal to the end of this postganglionic neuron of the parasympathetic nervous system, which is going to release acetylcholine again. But now acetylcholine is going to bind a muscarinic receptor at the target. All right, so muscarinic, we're going to think about muscarinic being synonymous with the parasympathetic nervous system, and it's going to contract smooth muscle of all the hollow organs, with the exception of the blood vessels and the sphincters. Sphincters are confusing. Sphincters are under the control of the sympathetic nervous system. All right. You might be remembering in one of the videos I said, well, what about the eye? And the parasympathetic nervous system stimulates the sphincter muscle of the eye, which is just, unfortunately, a bad choice of names for that muscle because it's not a true sphincter, it's a muscle, which we call a sphincter muscle. Anyway, that's an exception, I guess. But all the other sphincters, like in the genitourinary tract, those guys are under the control of the sympathetic nervous system. Or I should say the sympathetic nervous system causes them to constrict. The sphincter muscle of the eye, the parasympathetic nervous system causes them to constrict, or it to constrict. All right, what else do we have going here? Exocrine glands, big time. This is wet and juicy. Remember, lots of secretions, very pro-secretion. So our exocrine glands are going to have muscarinic receptors in order for that to happen. I mentioned already that the parasympathetic nervous system does exert some control over the heart. It's going to decrease the heart rate. It actually kind of dominates in that capacity, and a very slight, hardly ever discussed effect on contractility. All right. I don't really want to spend any time with this, and I don't emphasize it in our class, but it is good to note that, yeah, we talk about the alpha receptors controlling the vasculature, and they do. They are big time controllers of vasculature. There are some muscarinic receptors, and those muscarinic receptors do dilate peripheral blood vessels a little bit, whereas the, remember I said the sympathetic nervous system, when it's stimulated, constricts. If you had both of those things happening at the same time, the sympathetic nervous system would exert a stronger pull. But when the sympathetic nervous system is not dominating and the parasympathetic nervous system is really on fire, you're going to see probably a little bit of dilation. But I'm not going to really emphasize that in our class because there's just so much to think about, and it's really the big controller of the vasculature is the sympathetic nervous system. All right, so again, you're going to refer to your chart and you're going to start to fill some of that information in your chart when you are studying. Or you could pause right now and that would be a good opportunity to do that as well. All right, so we said acetylcholine is released here at the junction of the parasympathetic nervous system and the target. Acetylcholine is released here at the ganglia of the parasympathetic nervous system. We just saw in the previous slide, acetylcholine is released at that ganglia as well, right? So this is just, again, the same thing I told you. Acetylcholine is released. So acetylcholine is essentially released all here. It's released at the targets of the parasympathetic nervous system, which are the muscarinic receptors binding there. It's released at all of the targets of both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. Or pardon me, at all the ganglia, all the ganglia of the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. We've got acetylcholine there. We also have acetylcholine at the neuromuscular junction, right? Acetylcholine is released there. So again, it's released at all the ganglia, at the targets of the parasympathetic nervous system, at the neuromuscular junction, and the other place acetylcholine is released is at the adrenal medulla, which I'll show you a picture of in a few minutes. It's coming in a second. So it's all over the place. When in doubt, go with acetylcholine. Chances are that's the one that's released, right? The only place we see norepi released is the targets of the sympathetic nervous system, right? So again, you're starting to try to organize this information in a way that works for you. Okay, so our cholinergic receptors, again, they are going to be nicotinic or muscarinic. So the nicotinic, again, stimulates all the ganglia, and it stimulates the adrenal medulla. Let me show you this picture. So this is a picture of all of this summarized. What we're focusing on here is right this part. This is the adrenal medulla. I kind of like to think of the adrenal medulla like a overgrown sympathetic ganglia because it's stimulated by a neuron that exits the central nervous system and it releases acetylcholine, just like all of our preganglionic neurons. At the adrenal medulla, we have a nicotinic receptor. The acetylcholine hits the nicotinic receptor and it stimulates the adrenal medulla. What the adrenal medulla does is it releases epinephrine and norepinephrine to some degree. It's about 80% epinephrine, about 20% norepinephrine into the blood, right? This is why the sympathetic response, that fight or flight response, is so incredibly robust, right? When we think about kind of our standard neural communication, we're thinking about kind of a controlled release of neurotransmitter into a synapse and then binding a receptor. When we're talking about a full-on fight or flight deal, we're talking about dumping epinephrine, which, if you didn't catch it before, epinephrine will bind all of the adrenergic receptors, alphas, beta 1s, and beta 2s. And that baby is being spit into the blood majorly. So we're like all hands on deck, serious response happening here. Okay, so that's acetylcholine nicotinic. What was the other thing on our slide? I think the neuromuscular, or that's coming next. In the next, we're going to look at that. And then, of course, the parasympathetic nervous system. Oh, all the ganglia. That's what was on there. Sorry. All the ganglia. Look. So here we've got sympathetic, parasympathetic. We've got preganglionic, releasing acetylcholine. So we could say, I don't think I've said this yet, but we could say all preganglionic neurons are cholinergic. Neurons that release acetylcholine are cholinergic. So all preganglionic neurons are cholinergic, meaning they all release acetylcholine. Acetylcholine here, acetylcholine here. At the postganglionic neurons of both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system, we have nicotinic receptors, right? And then the other place is right here, right? Here's another nicotinic receptor. So that one's going to stimulate the neuromuscular junction, causing us to see a contraction of skeletal muscle. Right, that's the voluntary response. So you might be thinking, because we're moving into drugs, and the target of most drugs is the synapse in some way or another. And so you might be thinking, like, why would you ever want to give a nicotinic drug? It's going to have such a crazy response because you have nicotinic receptors at all your ganglia. So you're essentially going to fire off your parasympathetic and sympathetic. So you'd see effects at the organs that are dominated by those two systems. You're going to see the predominant effects at those organs. And I'll tell you some more about that in 1 second. You're also going to see, if you've got a nicotinic drug, you would see some adrenal medulla effects potentially. And you also have this thing going on at the neuromuscular junction. So you might be thinking, like, would you ever want to use these drugs? Not really. We do use them for pretty narrow, there's a fairly narrow use, and that is specifically to target the neuromuscular junction. And most specifically, they're used kind of as in tandem with other medications for surgical procedures, most notably when you're trying to paralyze skeletal muscle. That's one of the goals of anesthesia, is to make sure that they're not moving around. And one of the ways you could accomplish that would be to block this receptor. So nicotinic blockers, or the word being nicotinic antagonist, right? Park on this receptor, and that acetylcholine can't get in there, so you don't get any skeletal muscle contraction. The only real good use for a nicotinic drug nowadays would be neuromuscular junction. However, there's all kinds of other drugs, and in your book, I'm not going to talk about them because we don't have time, but in your book, I believe it's the last page of this unit, there's like a box, and in that box, there's other ways to affect the skeletal muscle, like direct muscle relaxers and etc., those kinds of things, which are used probably more frequently, because if you give a nicotinic drug, you block the nicotinic, if you give a nicotinic blocker to do this, here, where's my cursor, block this, you're also going to shut down all your ganglia, and your adrenal medulla. I don't know if that's a very good idea. Very rarely would that be a good idea. However, it's an option. Okay. So here we have a chart. Again, this is a summary of kind of what we've been going over. This is in your book. This picture is in your book. You're going to have some opportunity to review this, right? This is what you need to have. Honestly, you really need to understand 3 things. You need to understand the neurotransmitters and the receptors. You need to know them. You cannot be guessing. You have got to know them cold. And the only way to do it is to memorize it, unfortunately. You need to know the concept of dual innervation, and you need to know the effect, what happens when you stimulate parasympathetic and sympathetic receptors. If you know what happens when you stimulate them, you can anticipate what would happen when you block them. Okay, so I'm going to ask you some questions and see if you're getting the hang of this. It's stressful, I know. So let's go with this. What type of drug can, sorry, I can't see because I have my tripod here. Okay, what type of drug can be used to increase the heart rate? So I'm giving you a minute to think about it. What kind of drug can be used to increase the heart rate? Remember back from our introduction to our course so far, we have really 2 types of drugs that interface with the receptors. Those that stimulate them, those are called agonists, and those that inhibit them, those are called antagonists. So how we want to approach something like this is think about the heart and think about the heart rate, which is set by the SA node in a normal case. So think about what kind of receptors we have at the SA node, right? We want to increase heart rate. So then you think, okay, is the heart dually innervated? The answer to that question is yes. So then that means we have sympathetic and parasympathetic receptors there. What would be, and this is a target, so the sympathetic receptor in the heart that influences heart rate is the beta-1 receptor. Now, do we want to stimulate it or do we want to block it? If we want to increase the heart rate, that's a fight or flight response, right? Increase in heart rate is one of the things you would expect. So we would want to stimulate that. So we'd want a beta-1 agonist. Now, if we didn't have dual innervation, would be done. But unfortunately, we're dually innervated. I mean, not really unfortunately, it works out for us, but unfortunate in terms of the learning curve. So then we have to think about the parasympathetic nervous system. When you stimulate the parasympathetic nervous system, it's going to oppose the sympathetic nervous system. So if you stimulate the beta-1 receptor, it increases heart rate. Then if you stimulated the parasympathetic receptor at the target, which is called the muscarinic receptor, that would decrease the heart rate. But that's not what we want to do, right? We want to increase the heart rate. So our other option, if we didn't have or didn't want to use a beta-1 agonist, we could also use a muscarinic antagonist. I know. It's a lot. Okay, let's try another one. So we just sort of talked this one through, but you can answer it. What kind of drug do we want to use to decrease the heart rate? So we have two options, right? Because we're dually innervated. We just went through this. So again, with the beta, same receptors, right? It's the same place, same part of the heart. So we're talking about nodal tissue, SA node and AB node predominantly. So if we wanted to decrease the heart rate, we could use that same beta-1 receptor, but this time we don't want to stimulate it, we want to block it. So it would be a beta-1 antagonist, or more commonly referred to as a beta blocker. The muscarinic side of things, the parasympathetic nervous system, when it is stimulated, does decrease the heart rate. So in this case, we'd want to do a muscarinic agonist. Good? Let's try another one. What kind of drug is best used to constrict peripheral blood vessels? Best drug. So we've been kind of going over this. Alpha receptors, right? Alpha receptors control the vasculature. That's what I want you to remember. Yes, there are some parasympathetic effects, and actually, to tell you the honest truth, there's some beta receptors too, but we're not going to go there because we're just trying to do the basics here. So alpha, alpha stimulation will consistently and reliably constrict your blood vessels, your arterioles specifically, all right? Which would do what to your blood pressure? Increase, right? Increase total peripheral resistance. How do we know that? Because I've already been telling you, that's the main receptor that dominates. So that's kind of what the question comes down to, like where are we in the body, what dominates it, and what's the response, right? So is the control of the blood vessels under sympathetic or parasympathetic control? It's sympathetic. This is one of the areas where we do not have much dual innervation. We really don't have hardly any at the arterioles. So that's sympathetic dominated. So we'd have to go with a sympathetic receptor, and what we want to do is stimulate it. All right. So our receptor possibilities, again, just for review, for the sympathetic nervous system, our receptor possibilities are the alpha ones, or alphas, we're not going to distinguish at this point, the beta ones and the beta 2s. But we know that the alphas are the ones at the blood vessels, so those are the ones we want to hit. We want to stimulate them, right? They're in control. They dominate, right? So this is kind of like how you have to work through it. Like, you know, figure out what questions you want to ask and ask them for each question that you're given. And then you'll start to get the hang of it. It does get easier, but it takes a long time. I mean, years in some cases. All right, so, whoops, animations are off target there. So what kind of drug is best used to decrease stomach secretions? So now we're talking about the gut, and we're talking about decreasing secretions. So our options are fight or flight or wet and juicy. So I'd go with the wet and juicy, which is the parasympathetic nervous system. But we don't want wet and juicy, we want to dry it up. So we're going to block it. It's the target, so it's muscarinic, right? All of the targets of the parasympathetic nervous system have muscarinic receptors. So a muscarinic blocker. We know that because we know that the control of the gut is dominated by the parasympathetic nervous system. It's absolutely dually innervated, but the dominant force is the parasympathetic nervous system in the gut. So our cholinergic receptor possibilities, again, just for review, only two. All cholinergic receptors bind acetylcholine, and our choices are muscarinic or nicotinic. So we're at the target, right? Nicotinic receptors are all over the place, but they are not at the target of the parasympathetic nervous system. They are at the at the targets, we have muscarinics. At the ganglia, we got nicotinics. At the adrenal medulla, we've got nicotinics. At the neuromuscular junction, we've got nicotinics. But we do not have nicotinic receptors at the target of the parasympathetic nervous system. So again, that's how we know it. So I would write these questions down, and for every question you're given, or even make some up, study with some friends and try to figure it out. Okay, here's another one. What kind of drug can either increase or decrease pupil dilation? That's a weird question. Increase or decrease. So when you have something like that, something's increasing or decreasing, same drug, it's all over the map, it's got to be nicotinic, right? Nicotinic agonist or nicotinic antagonist. Remember, those fire off the ganglia. So when you give a nicotinic drug, you're going to be seeing essentially, potentially, the stimulation of the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system. So we don't really like nicotinic drugs too much, right? But they're the only ones that control both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. There are definitely other drugs that we're going to use to increase or decrease pupil dilation. But the point of this slide is this was one drug that can do both. That's why nicotinic fits here. They're super weird. They're really variable. And again, the only real good reason to give them in this day and age is if you're trying to affect skeletal muscle. Oops, there it is. All right. How are you feeling on all this? So when the rubber meets the road and you have all these choices and you're trying to figure it out, which drug do you use? If you have dual innervation, which one do you choose? I've alluded to this, right? Do you want to, stimulate the sympathetic nervous system? Do you want to inhibit the parasympathetic nervous system? Or do you want to inhibit the sympathetic nervous system and stimulate the parasympathetic nervous system? How do you go about doing this? And what it all comes down to is which system is dominating that particular part of the body that you're trying to affect. If you can go with the dominant division, you're going to have better success. Sometimes you can't, and we'll kind of talk about that when we get into the drugs independently, but if you can, that would be the best way to go. So in terms of which system, the sympathetic nervous system dominates, we've got the heart. The heart, the force of contraction specifically. The heart rate, the jury's kind of out in terms of heart rate. I was taught that the parasympathetic nervous system really is the dominant force of the heart rate, but the force of contraction, absolutely the sympathetic nervous system, and also absolutely the blood vessels. No questions asked there. The respiratory rate is the respiratory system is dominated by the the sympathetic nervous system, right? When opening up that airway is a very important feature. And metabolic rate is definitely dominated by the sympathetic nervous system. All the restorative functions, though, those are all dominated by the parasympathetic nervous system. So the GI, the genitourinary, focus of the eye, pupil dilation is a little bit of both, but the eye focus is dominated by the parasympathetic nervous system, right? The ability to focus. And then, of course, the nicotinic system controls the ganglia, but that's not really a system, but also absolutely interfaces with the skeletal muscle. So that's kind of the setup. Here's this picture again in its totality, which again, I would recommend that you recreate and use this and continue going over this until you can draw this out on your own, labeling. I would recommend colors. I would actually use a different color for the norepinephrine and the epinephrine, but shapes and colors, and really, really, nailing this before you get into the drugs, because it's just, if you know this organization, if you know the difference between sympathetic and parasympathetic stimulation, fight or flight versus rest and digest, if you know the concept of dual innervation and importantly what areas are not dually innervated, then when it comes to knowing the drugs, it's going to be easier. You will be able to more or less use common sense to answer questions, going through that sort of process that we went through. Like what are you trying to do? What kinds of receptors are there? What's dominating, etc. So keep going through this. Don't lose hope. it will get easier. And next video and in our class, when we meet together, we are going to start to do the drugs.